Churchill biographer Martin Gilbert discusses Mr. Churchill's relationship with the Jewish people and his book, The Jews in the 20th Century. The author argues that Mr. Churchill was an advocate of Jewish equal rights and details his role in the formation of the Middle East and subsequent developments. The event's 1 hour.
Since the rise of representative modern government in the 18th century, the two greatest democratic statesmen, in my opinion, have been Abraham Lincoln and Winston Churchill. And I think it's a measure of the intellectual seriousness of the Claremont Institute that we count among our distinguished fellows the two finest living scholars of those two statesmen. The first, of course, is Professor Harry V. Jaffa, author of Crisis of the House Divided and A New Birth of Freedom. Just recently, the historian Alan Guelzo said that Crisis of the House Divided is the best book written on Abraham Lincoln in the entire 20th century. And of course, our other distinguished fellow is our speaker this evening. Our speaker this evening is widely, in fact, universally acknowledged as one of the greatest historians of the 20th century. We're pleased that he has made it into the 21st century and has traveled safely from Great Britain to Southern California so that he can join us for dinner tonight. Our speaker is best known as the official biographer of Winston Churchill. The official biography, as all of you know who have read it, is monumental in every sense of the word. For example, it is listed in Guinness's Book of Records as the longest biography in publishing history, running to 7.6 million words. It will never be surpassed unless, of course, someone sets out to write 8 million superfluous words on the same subject. Let me put this achievement in perspective. This is the equivalent of writing 1,000 words every working day for 30 years. But of course, at this level of historical writing, you don't just dash off 1,000 words a day. There is an immense and painstaking preliminary work that needs to be done before you even begin writing. In the case of someone like a Churchill, you begin by amassing not tens of thousands, really probably hundreds of thousands of documents, letters, and records. Then you have to arrange all of that massive material in some coherent form. And once you have it arranged, then you have to master all of that data. And having done that, you then have to weave it into a compelling narrative of a life that stretched over 91 years, almost every moment of which was filled with controversy and action. If our speaker had nothing else to do while writing the official biography, it would still stand as a triumph of scholarship. And yet, during that time, during his idle moments, he was not lounging around eating bonbons. During that 30-year period, he wrote 30 additional volumes on a variety of subjects. I, at the moment, happen to be reading a couple of those volumes. This, for example, is a history of the state of Israel. That's one of the volumes he's written. This one is a volume in his History of the 20th Century, a 3-volume work. Now, I appeal to any of you who has ever tried to write a term paper. Imagine tossing off one of these every year for 30 years, while at the same time writing the longest biography ever published. That is an extraordinary achievement. But this is not all by any means. This scholarly output has occurred during a time when our speaker was traveling more or less nonstop all over the world, lecturing, speaking, debating, and serving as both an author and as an advisor to a great variety of television productions, films, and documentaries. In 1995, he paused briefly to be knighted by the Queen of England for his service to British history and international relations. We Americans tend to be too much impressed by size and by quantity. What is the heart and soul of all of this work? What is the theme running through this prodigious flow of words? It's the theme of human freedom. One way of looking at the 20th century is to see it as a long confrontation between the principles of free government on the one hand and the principles of a totalitarianism on the other, whether in the form of Marxist communism, National Socialism, or theocratic despotism, whether as represented by Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler or Osama bin Laden. In the name of theocratic despotism, our country has recently been invaded, our fellow citizens massacred, our property destroyed, and our population terrorized. Soon our soldiers and the soldiers of our British ally will begin to fall on foreign soil. As we study the life of Winston Churchill, we come to understand better the necessity and the nobility of those impending sacrifices. And there is no better way to study the life of Sir Winston Churchill than through the works of our speaker this evening. We are much wiser for the work he has done, and we are honored by his presence. Please welcome Sir Martin Gilbert.
Well, thank you very much for those extremely encouraging and generous words. A few days ago, Tony Blair described the period we're going through as a testing time. And I'm proud at this testing time to be standing between your flag and my flag. Today, the 2nd of November, is Balfour Day. 84 years ago today, the British government, of which Churchill was then a member, promised the Jews, a scattered, dispersed and often persecuted people, a national home in Palestine. Churchill was then 43 years old and had strongly supported the Jewish desire to have a homeland and to be treated as a nationality and to have the right of self-defense and to establish their own political institutions. How had this 43-year-old come to have any views at all about Jews? He was from an aristocratic British family. His grandfather, when he was born, was Duke of Marlborough. And indeed, it was from this very fact that his first contact with Jews arose. Because his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, a young and dynamic conservative politician, had very unusually, for that time, the 1870s and 1880s, a number of close and good Jewish friends. And within the Marlborough-Churchill household, Lord Randolph Churchill was much criticized by his brothers and cousins for having these Jewish friends. Perhaps young boys always take their father's side when they see their father under attack by other relatives. Certainly the young Winston was immediately drawn to defend his father pugnaciously, to speak openly against his relatives who made, for that time, typically anti-Jewish sentiments, and himself to find the friendship of his father's friends and their children something attractive and enticing. a record survives of Churchill spending a weekend at one of the Rothschild houses outside London and being listened to with rapt attention by these great Jewish bankers and philanthropists as he, aged 15, expounded his views on the political future of Britain. And then when his father died, at the tragically young age of 52, leaving the 19-year-old Churchill devastated and responsible, as he saw it, for both his mother, the American Jenny Jerome, and for his brother, his younger brother, Jack, it was to one of his father's Jewish friends that he turned, not just for financial advice and help, but for moral support. And this Jewish gentleman, Sir Ernest Cassell, a banker and philanthropist, became for Churchill, in loco parentis, became his father in many ways, and helped set him up both a little home, a little apartment in London's Mayfair, and also with all sorts of advice and encouragement. And then he had a school friend, a Jewish school friend, who was the illegitimate son of a very great Jewish philanthropist, Baron Hirsch. The Baron, as he was known, had established Jewish colonies in the Argentine, in Canada, and in Palestine, and was strongly of the belief that Jews should have some territorial base. And his illegitimate son, who was known affectionately by Churchill as Tutti, was at school with him, and then sought to enter Parliament in the 1910 election, and was opposed by those who said, we don't want any more Jews representing us in Parliament. And Churchill, who had then just entered government, turned up at the hustings during the election and rounded upon the critics of his friend and said, whatever you might think of him, his politics, his opinions, you cannot be against him because of his race. When Churchill was disillusioned with the Conservatives, having served in Parliament as a Conservative for 4 years, the cause was that he simply found the Conservative attitude at that time towards the underdog, whether in the Empire or at home, unacceptable. And when the Prime Minister of the day, Arthur Balfour, the very man who was to put his name to the Balfour Declaration in 1917, when Arthur Balfour brought in an extraordinarily severe Act of Parliament restricting Jewish immigration, this was in 1905, Churchill, astonishingly for a young member of Parliament, challenged the bill, which had some 155 clauses in it, a typical Act of Parliament, challenged it clause by clause, wouldn't allow his fellow members of Parliament to go home early for dinner or even to go to bed. He insisted that every clause be debated, and showing really his future genius at parliamentary work, slowly and steadily gathered around him, through his young leadership, other members of Parliament who slowly undermined the rigors of the bill. Of course, the Jews were delighted, the British Jews, that he had done so. When I was going through his letters to his mother, I tried to find examples of his reaction to the events of the day which related to Jewish issues. And I was surprised to find that when he was 23 and still a soldier serving in India and Africa, he wrote to his mother with great anger about the trial of Captain Dreyfus in France. And in one of his letters, when Émile Zola challenged this appalling anti-Semitic travesty of justice in the French army, he wrote to his mother, "Bravo, Zola. I'm delighted to witness the complete debacle of this monstrous conspiracy." During his speaking on the Aliens Bill in 1905, during this extraordinarily mammoth attack on the legislation, Churchill not only dealt with the specifics of excluding people from asylum and from the ability to become citizens, but he also warned specifically, I quote, of the dangers of any legislation based on intolerant anti-Semitism. Such anti-Semitism will be gratifying to a small but noisy section of the supporters of the Conservative Party. The government will purchase a little popularity by dealing harshly with a number of unfortunate Jews who have no votes. The bill commends itself to those who like patriotism at other people's expense and admire imperialism on the Russian Tsarist model. Because Churchill had spoken as he did in favor of Jewish immigration and against these restrictions, a group of Jews approached him some 2 months later and asked if he would be willing to support a Zionist project, not for a Jewish home in Palestine, because the Turks who ruled Palestine then were implacably opposed to such a thing, but to some other Zion, some other place of refuge for the Jewish people. And the proposal at that time was for a territory of land which Britain was willing to grant, the British government was willing to grant, in what is now Uganda, in the highlands of Uganda. And Churchill pondered this request, and he wrote a letter to the leaders of the Jewish community, which I'd like to read because it was written exactly 40 years before the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. And in this letter, which I found the various drafts, he took a lot of trouble with his letters. In parentheses, one ought to say that he wrote all his own speeches and all his own letters. He was not like some modern politicians who have others write their speeches for them. Yesterday I met a man who was apparently a vice president of the Disney organization, and his claim to fame was that he wrote the speeches of the president of the Disney organization, right? Well, Winston Churchill wrote his own speeches and letters, and this is what he wrote to the Jewish leaders who said, would you support a Jewish national home, a Jewish state in Africa, in East Africa? And he wrote, I'm in full sympathy with the historical, traditional aspirations of the Jews. The restoration to them of a center of true racial and political integrity would be a tremendous event in the history of the world. Whether the wide effort of the Jewish race should be concentrated upon Palestine to the exclusion of all other temporary solutions, or whether some other outlet of relief and place of unification should be provided for the bitter need of those who suffer from day to day, are questions on which I find it difficult to express an opinion. I have sympathy with your efforts to reach what must be your ultimate goal. Jerusalem must be the only ultimate goal. When it will be achieved, it is vain to prophesy, but that it will someday be achieved is one of the few certainties of the future. Well, extraordinary that he in 1908 should see that as a certainty. And then in 1914, with the beginning of World War I, Britain found itself at war with the Turkish Empire, and within 2 years had set as one of its goals the conquest of the Turkish Empire in Arabia and the Near East, the Middle East as we call it today. And then there occurred a strange episode in British history. Lenin and the Bolsheviks, seeking to come to power, said that they would withdraw Russia from the war if they came to power. And this was a desperate danger to the Allies, to Britain, France, the United States, because if Russia pulled out of the war, all the German troops fighting against Russia would be transferred to the Western Front and would simply swamp the soldiers we had managed to put in place. And so the British government devised a plan to appeal to the Jews of Russia to insist that their government remained at war, and to win the support of the Jews of Russia by promising a Jewish national home in Palestine. Now that was the cynical, realpolitik reason. But during the discussions of this in the inner cabinet and the inner councils of which Churchill was a part, it's astonishing to see how these hard-headed, war-making cabinet ministers are constantly almost deflected from their cynicism by a sense that there is more to it, more to this Jewish national home than simply winning a voice of military approval from 3 million Russian Jews. There is also an ideal. There is also a, as Churchill put it, harmony in giving one tiny part of the globe to a people who did not have a national home and who had these links and feelings towards that particular region. And so what began as a cynical exercise ended up as a powerful ideological one. And when the war was over, Turkey defeated, and British rule established in Palestine under the League of Nations, it fell to Churchill, who had been appointed Secretary of State for the colonies, it fell to Churchill to draw up the terms whereby the Jews would be allowed to go to Palestine and what they should establish there. First of all, he had no doubt, as he put it, both publicly and privately inside the cabinet, that, as I quote, if, as may well happen, as a result of our mandate in Palestine, there should be created in our lifetime, by the bank of the River Jordan, a Jewish state which might comprise of 3 or 4 millions of Jews, an event would have occurred in the history of the world which would, from every point of view, be beneficial. Now, as there were then 55,000 Jews in Palestine, that he could envisage 3 or 4 million was in itself remarkable. And then in March 1921, he went out to Palestine to see for himself what the situation was and to make arrangements to establish the ground rules whereby the Jews would be there. And the first rule he established was, I quote, that the Jews are in Palestine of right and not on sufferance. Now, sufferance came from two sides. First of all, the British could say, well, we suffer you, we allow you, we permit you to be there. He said, not at all. They're there as of right. And secondly, while he was there, he received some 50 petitions, all of which I've seen, signed by the leading Palestinian Arabs, demanding an immediate halt to Jewish immigration, which had by then raised the population from some 55 to some 57,000 Jews. And he said this right, as opposed to sufferance, is also a right for the Jews to continue to enter the country until such time as they would form a majority. A majority on the basis of one man, one vote, and a parliamentary system. And he established what was called the Jewish Agency for Palestine to be a shadow government, to contain ministries for health, education, welfare, even a foreign ministry, so that the Jews could build up not only their numbers, and under his prescription, the Jewish population rose from 55,000 to 550,000, that they should also be enabled to establish the institutions of statehood, if you like, in miniature, the shadow institutions of statehood. He was under pressure both from the very conservatives who had attacked him in 1905 for wanting to open, as they put it, the floodgates of Britain to Jewish immigration, and now said that he was doing the same for Palestine. He was attacked by these conservatives, and in a very dramatic vote in the House of Lords, his whole policy was thrown out. But as a result of the reform of the House of Lords, some 10 years earlier, the House of Commons were able to reverse this astounding decision. Churchill was a man who believed that you confronted your critics face on, and you didn't give to one group of petitioners or protesters the answers which would please them. And so while he was still in Jerusalem, a group of the leading Arab dignitaries came to see him and asked him, one, to repudiate the Balfour Declaration, and two, to halt any further immigration of Jews to Palestine. He spoke to them as follows: "You are not addressing yourselves to the reality of the situation. It is manifestly right that the Jews who are scattered all over the world should have a national center and a national home where some of them may be reunited. And where else could that be but in this land of Palestine, with which for more than 3,000 years they've been intimately and profoundly associated. We think it will be good for the world and good for the Jews. But we also think it will be good for you who dwell in Palestine, and we intend that it will be good for you. The task before the Zionists is one of extraordinary difficulty." This is Churchill addressing himself to the leading Arab protesters. "We intend to develop representative institutions leading up to full self-government. And if the Jews are able to build up this country, both in terms of numbers and in terms of the life here, then they will become the majority." In order to ensure that this took place, Churchill gave the small Jewish community in Palestine the right to develop its electoral power, the electoral power which would build the cities and drive the new industry. Here too, he was savagely attacked in the British Parliament for having given the Jews, if you like, a lift up, something which would enable them to at least try to turn this essentially backward and desert country into something flourishing and strong. Historical research is a curious thing. During his answer to his critics in Parliament, he made reference to a visit which he had made to one of the Jewish towns which had been established in the 1880s called Rishon LeZion in the coastal plain, which had orange groves and also vineyards. And he described his visit in very moving terms, very exciting terms. And I remember thinking, I wonder if I can find in the archives of this little place some documents relating to his visit. So I went there, and I went to see the mayor. It's a tiny little place. And I said, do you have any archives, which I could see? And he said, well, we do have a cupboard. He said, pointing to a cupboard, a wooden cupboard. He said, we do have a cupboard with the archives in it. And he opened the cupboard door, and there were, from floor to ceiling, bundles of paper, all wrapped up in tape of one sort or another. And I managed to find one which was marked Colonial Secretary's Visit, March 1921. And there was a fascinating discussion, which any of you who are involved in public life or in trying to get an institution going or trying to get the support of a politician or a philanthropist for your endeavors might find instructive. The people who had founded this town, who were by then elderly pioneers and highly respected, said, what an opportunity. Churchill is coming. We must set out in front of him all our problems. How many attacks we have had from the Arab villages around. The awful drought which has destroyed our fruit. The awful diseases which are attacking our vineyards. And they drew up a powerful bill of depressed indictment of their situation. But the youngsters who were at the meeting said, not at all. We must show him what we can achieve. We must show him what's going for us, what we feel that we can turn this country into. And so they decided that when he came down in his car from Jerusalem and reached the road, which is about 3 miles from the main road to their village, they would meet him on horseback. Unfortunately, they didn't have enough horses, so they dug into their little municipal pot, which didn't have much money in it, and went to the nearest Arab village, which was a friendly village, and hired the horses they could ride. Was this effective? Here is Churchill talking to the House of Commons in the debate which secured the mandate for Palestine as a Jewish national home. Anyone, said Churchill, who has seen the work of the Jewish colonies which have been established in the last 20 or 30 years in Palestine will be struck by the enormous productive results which they have achieved. I had the opportunity of visiting the colony of Rishon LeZion, and from the most inhospitable side, surrounded everywhere by barrenness and the most miserable form of cultivation, I was taken into a fertile and thriving country estate where vineyards and the most beautifully luxurious orange groves had been created by the exertions of the Jewish community who lived there. As we went into the village, I was surrounded by 50 or 60 young Jews galloping on their horses, and when we reached the center of the village, 300 or 400 of the most beautiful children and about an equal number of white-clothed damsels. We were invited to sample the excellent wines which the establishment produced and to inspect the many beauties of the orange groves. Nothing was said to him of the terrible pressures and torments of life in that village. Instead, he was inspired by the optimism and the opportunities. And so when he was confronted at the next imperial conference by a Canadian Prime Minister who poured scorn on the whole idea of a Jewish national home, Churchill said to him, I must tell you that the Zionist ideal is a very great ideal, and I confess that for myself it is one that claims my keen personal sympathy. If in the course of time the Jews became the majority in that country, they would naturally take it over and make it their state. Now, as often happens in British politics, governments are defeated, And only 6 months after Churchill secured the terms of the mandate of the League of Nations, whereby the Jews could come in unrestricted, of right and not on sufferance, the government of which he was a part was thrown out and a new Conservative government came to power. And slowly, and to Churchill's constant protestations, the pledge he had made was whittled away until on the eve of World War II in 1939, Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister issued a new white paper, British government policy paper, known to the Jews as the Black Paper, which ended Churchill's promise. He was furious and pointed out that everything Chamberlain was doing at that time was based on the appeasement and groveling to the Germans, to the Nazi Germans, and that because the Arabs, the Arab states, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Arabs of Syria, Iraq, were flirting with Nazi Germany and were producing more and more extreme anti-Jewish propaganda and carrying out acts of terror in Palestine, Churchill pointed out that this was a grotesque act of appeasement to curb the Jewish rights, which had been established not only by Britain, but by the League of Nations, because of this external pressure. The government proceeded irrespective of his protests. He was not a member of it, although he was a very senior politician. And under the White Paper of 1939, after 5 years, the majority in the country were to be its rulers. At the same time, virtually no further Jewish immigration was to be allowed. So that in May 1944, an Arab majority would come to power, committed to ending any form of Jewish self-government or autonomy. When Churchill became Prime Minister, he was informed by the Conservative leaders that he had no authority to reverse decisions of the British Parliament which had been made in peacetime by massive majorities. He was Prime Minister, he could conduct the war, hopefully he could prevent the country being defeated by Germany, hopefully he might even reverse the tide of defeat and turn it to victory, but pre-war decisions of the Parliament could not be reversed. And it's fascinating to see how, as the war developed, he slowly, surreptitiously, disingenuously, if you like, pushed and pushed to try to get this date which would end all hopes of Jewish statehood, May 1944, to get the date somehow forgotten and passed over, as indeed it was. When, on one occasion, the leading Conservative figures in his government and two leading Labour figures, because he had a national government, when they came to him and said, on no account must you prevent there being an Arab majority government in May 1944, he said, well, I've got some other ideas, and I think in addition to the Jewish national home in Palestine, I would like to propose 2 mandates for the Jewish people after the war because of what they had suffered during the war. I propose that we give them a mandate, as the victorious Allied powers, I propose we give them a mandate over Abyssinia and a mandate over Libya. And one can only imagine what would have happened if the Jews had been fortunate enough to have the oil of Colonel Gaddafi's great country. Anyway, this push in the direction, if you like, of Israeli colonies somehow forced Churchill's colleagues to accept that they would not prevent the Jews from becoming a state after the war. He kept a very vigilant watch on what was happening to the Jews during the war, and again tried to devise measures which would help mitigate the awful situation taking place behind the the Nazi rule and the Nazi control. I found, for example, a fascinating correspondence which he had with President Roosevelt, who had declined, for reasons of American policy, which you will know better than me, who had declined to open refugee camps for Jews fleeing Europe who reached North Africa, which was then just under Anglo-American control. And Churchill pressed and pressed until Roosevelt gave way. And when it came to announcing in 1942 everything that was known about the terrible fate of the Jews, largely as a result of a very courageous Polish courier, Polish Catholic courier called Jan Karski, who had reached the West, and it was decided at the highest level that all the information he brought should immediately be publicized. The American government wanted to say, this is what we're told, and it may be true or it may not be true. And Churchill said, no, we know it is true, and we have to say with all our authority as British and American leaders that this is what is happening to the Jews of Europe. And so this was in fact done. Churchill had a scheme as the war was coming to an end, that when the war was over, the victorious Allies, himself and Roosevelt, would have a conference, possibly held in Egypt, at which he would establish the king of Saudi Arabia, the wealthiest and most powerful of all the Arab rulers, as the head of a great Arab federation of the Middle East, with an independent Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Jordan, and that in return for the Arabs being given this great independent federation, they would permit the Jews to have a state in Palestine from the Mediterranean to the River Jordan. Churchill discussed this scheme, not only with the Zionist leader, Dr. Weizmann, who was, of course, tremendously excited by it, but also with King Ibn Saud, the king of Saudi Arabia, whom he met in February 1945 in Egypt. And all was set to do this. Documents, papers, plans were prepared. And then, as you know, in July 1945, the British electorate decided they did not want a return of the Conservatives to power, and so not only the Conservatives, but also their leader, Winston Churchill, found themselves out of power. Churchill still hoped that the new government, the Labour government, under Clement Attlee, would be sympathetic to his concept of Jewish statehood. But the Labour government took a different course, refused to allow the 100,000 or so survivors of the Holocaust to enter the country which Churchill had said belonged to the Jews of right and not of sufferance, and eventually turned over the whole future of the country to the United Nations, turned its back on its Balfour Declaration, whose anniversary we celebrate today, and turned its back on its pledges to the Jews. In opposition, Churchill had to watch, he spoke of course, but had to watch politically helpless as the British government not only turned its back on the Jews in Palestine, but seemed to favor the Arab armies, the Arab nations, who, when Israel declared its independence in 1948, invaded the country. In the House of Commons, there was an upsurge of anti-Semitic feeling. And it fell not to Clement Attlee, the Prime Minister, a decent and able man, but to Winston Churchill, the leader of the opposition, without political power, to set up as a matter of principle that anti-Semitism should not be part and parcel of any policy. I wish to tell the House of Commons that I am against preventing Jews from doing anything which other people are allowed to do. I'm against that, and I have the strongest abhorrence of the anti-Semitic line of prejudice. Churchill became Prime Minister again in 1951. Israel had already been established for 3 years. His very first message as Prime Minister was a message to Dr. Weizmann, who had become President of Israel, congratulating him and congratulating the country. When Churchill came as Prime Minister to the United States in 1952, he was shocked to discover that the American leaders whom he met were not as enthusiastic as he was about the new Jewish state. And so he spoke to a joint session of the Congress and made a particular point of urging the congressmen not to turn their back on the Zionist experiment, which was, of course, so new and yet so under threat from attack both within and without. And he said to the Congress, as a Zionist, from the days of the Balfour Declaration, I have watched with admiration the courageous effort of Israel to establish her independence and prosperity. Strange in a way that of all the causes Churchill took up, this was the one which perhaps his fellow countrymen least supported, and which he found also the least support for when he was abroad. On his return to the United States, on his second visit as Prime Minister, he was astonished when Eisenhower, the President, spoke to him very bitterly about the Zionist experiment, about the State of Israel. And I'd like to end with his remarks to Eisenhower recorded in the secret protocol of their discussions. I'm a Zionist. Let me make that clear. I was one of the original ones after the Balfour Declaration, and I've worked faithfully for it. I think it is a most wonderful thing that this community should have established itself so effectively, turning the desert into fertile gardens and thriving townships, and should have afforded a refuge to millions of their co-religionists who have suffered under Hitler, and not only under Hitler's persecution. I think it is a wonderful thing. Thank you.
Really remarkable.
Thank you.
Really well done. Sir Martin has agreed to answer a few questions.
Before I do, I see this was a wine-free dinner, but it was a water-free podium. So if I could get a...
Tom, could you bring... Don't fall off the... Do we have a question? Yes, one over here.
Sir, I don't know whether I missed it.
Excuse me, we have a microphone coming because this is all being filmed by C-SPAN for book notes.
Oh, thank you. Good. Sir, I don't know if I missed it or not in your talk, but could you tell us some details about the development of the Balfour Declaration, the source of it, and what it promised, why, and one other thing, if you could tell us also about the country that ultimately became Transjordan and then Jordan, and what portion of that was or may have been part of the originally planned Jewish state.
Well, I thought I had spoken about the Balfour Declaration. Basically, the Balfour Declaration stated that Britain looked with favor upon the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, subject to there be no injustice to the other communities in the country. The Balfour Declaration was a statement made when Britain was not ruler of Palestine. So it was the League of Nations mandate which Churchill drafted, the details which I gave you, which essentially turned the Balfour Declaration into a promise of a national home, into an actual structure with regulations that the Jews could emigrate into it, that it would have Jewish institutions and so on. The question of Transjordan is fascinating. Transjordan was the desert area, or the largely desert area, which lay to the east of the River Jordan. By the time of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, or the League of Nations mandate in 1922, the Jews had, since the 1880s, acquired considerable areas of land to the west of the River Jordan, in the coastal area, in the Galilee, and around Jerusalem. There were no Jewish farms or land east of the Jordan at all, though ironically there was Jewish-owned land on what became the Golan Heights, which was acquired by France in 1919. Churchill's idea with regard to the establishment of a Jordanian kingdom led by King Abdullah was that there could be an independent kingdom east of the River Jordan, provided that kingdom guaranteed that it would allow the Jews to establish their national home on the other side of the river, between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean. That is the area which today comprises both Israel and the West Bank, which is now quite heavily populated by Palestinian Arabs, but at that time was much less populated. So the establishment of Transjordan, which many Zionists who don't know the background feel was somehow taking land away from the Jewish homeland, in fact ensured that the Jewish homeland could be at its largest extent, a far larger extent than it will have today, and also that the Arabs would not attack it, something which of course they reneged on, the promise which King Abdullah had made to Churchill. There was another factor which Churchill understood, and which isn't always understood today, and that is that there was also a massive Arab immigration into Palestine. And when Churchill spoke against the restrictions which the British government imposed on Jewish immigration in 1939, the savage restrictions, he pointed out that more Arabs had entered the country as immigrants between 1920 and 1939 than Jews had entered the country. And this was true. There had been a massive influx of Arabs from Egypt, from Saudi Arabia, from North Africa. And it was this which, in a way, changed the demographic balance on what is now the West Bank. Families such as Arafat's, who were Egyptian, moved into Gaza, moved into the area under British rule, because it was well governed, the roads were built, it had an infrastructure, and was attractive to immigrants. So when the British government decided to halt Jewish immigration, it effectively transferred the gauntlet of political power to the Arabs, because they had taken advantage of, if you like, the situation created by the Balfour Declaration. And that was very unfortunate for the Jews. The other thing which Churchill did was that he encouraged the growth both of Jewish national institutions and Arab national institutions. But the Arabs of Palestine refused to follow that path. It's extraordinary to people looking back that the offers that the Arabs of Palestine were made, first of all to have an Arab agency, just as the Jews had a Jewish agency, within which they could have ministries, health, welfare, education, the things I mentioned, they turned it down. And then again in 1937, when the British government had in mind to create both a Jewish state and an Arab state, in other words, to accept that there had been this considerable Arab immigration, that cities like Nablus and Hebron, Ramallah, Jenin, all of which are in the news today, Gaza, were Arab cities, and therefore they offered the Palestinian Arabs a state in the Arab areas of Palestine and the Jews a state in the Jewish areas of Palestine. The Jews accepted it, and the Arabs rejected it. So here again, it was somehow the natural evolution of political institutions in Palestine, of which the Jews would have been the beneficiaries and the Arabs, couldn't take place because of the Arab rejection. When statehood came in 1948, again the Arabs rejected the United Nations vote which gave them statehood in their part of the area. They rejected it absolutely. The Jews accepted it. And what the Jews had by then, as a result of Churchill's encouragement and their own initiatives following it, was that they had the institutions of statehood already in place. They had their ministries, they had their experience, they had their educational system, and this was something which I think more than anything Churchill had contributed to.
Yes, Lee?
We're all quite worried about
You can wait just for a microphone.
We're all quite worried about what's going on in Israel and the West Bank right now. Can you see through to a short-term solution to what's happening? And can you see through, and I know this is a lot harder, to a long-term solution of the Arab-Israeli conflict in the Middle East?
Well, I can't really answer that question. I mean, it's a very difficult one. In the short term, the solution presumably is something such as the Mitchell and Tenet plans, these two American plans for ceasefires and disengagement. Certainly you can't build any form of agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority without an end to the immediate violence. And I think that must take place sooner or later, hopefully without there being a massive bloodshed and fighting in between. As to the long term, it must be what was proposed by the Israelis at Tabor, drawing on the Camp David agreement and drawing, of course, on Oslo, and that is a Jewish state which is accepted by the Palestinian Arabs and by the other Arab states around, and a Palestinian state which contains, as the Tabor negotiations wanted it to contain, the most recent negotiations between Barak and Arafat, an Arab state which contains every Arab living in the area. As you know, the offer which Israel made was for some 95% of the West Bank, including all the Arab inhabited areas, to go to the Palestinian Authority and a Palestinian state. And the 5% that was excluded, in which no Arabs were living, Israel would compensate by giving up an area of Israel to the Palestinian Authority. So this, was an extraordinary offer. And to this day, it's not clear, there are many theories, but it's not clear why Chairman Arafat rejected it. Later this year, or next year, or in 5 years' time, that will presumably be, or 10 years' time, the form that the final settlement takes. Two states living side by side, perhaps initially with very strong border fences and border walls, perhaps even with United Nations patrols, as between Turks and Greeks on Cyprus, but eventually living together. I mean, I was very much involved with the discussions in 1995, both before and after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, when not only was there to be a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, each ruling their own area, but also a Middle East economic condominium, a Middle East economic union, not dissimilar to the European Union, which we are creating and still expanding, whereby all the countries of the Middle East, including Israel, will be part of an integrated economic system. And there was a time, 4 or 5 years ago, when industrial parks were established on Israel's border with the Palestinian Authority, and these industrial parks were very remarkable because they actually crossed the border but each park had Jews and Arabs, or Israelis and Palestinians, at every level, at the managerial level, at the middle management level, at the productive level, at the distribution level, at the marketing level. And these things seem for a while to be the way forward then. You know, how could people turn their back on economic unity, on economic prosperity and expansion? Well, they collapse, but I think they must be the form that the future will take. A tremendously prosperous region with the two states living side by side. I only hope that I live to see it.
I wanted to thank you all for coming. It's been a rather long evening, and Sir Martin has another busy day tomorrow over on the Queen Mary.
Yeah.
And so once again, I want to thank you, sir, for coming to Chapman.
It's a great pleasure.
We really enjoyed it. Thank you all for coming.
Sir Martin Gilbert is the official biographer of Winston Churchill, and his 6 volumes have placed him in the Guinness Book of World Records for the longest written biography in history. His latest work, The Jews in the 20th Century, is published by Schocken Books. For more information, visit them on the web at randomhouse.com/Schocken. Next week on History on Book TV, Yale University professor Joanne Freeman details early American